Before Second World War, there was probably some 800, 850 persons of Jewish nationality in all Slovenia. More than half of them lived in Prekmurje. In Murska Sobota and Lendava were the two communities with the synagogue and okay. In Maribor, there was 100 Jews, that means 1/8 of all the number. And that community was quite interesting because it was became important just before Second World War. Because you know, Maribor was at that time actually an industrial town with some big factories, and the owners of the factories, some of them were Jews. Some of them were locals, some of them were just from what is today Czech Republic. And there was not just that owners of the factory, there was that middle level, the engineers and so on. And what's the most important signs of how that community of Maribor before Second World War was important is the number of the children. Because I used to work in what is today Prva Gimnazija Maribor, first grammar school of Maribor, which was before Second World War Realna Gimnazija. So some kind of gymnasium, yes. And I found that there was before Second World War, there was approximately 20 students of that school who are actually Jews. So it means that students were very young, with some people which are same careers and so on. But then came war, and some of them managed to escape before the occupation. Some of them were expelled at the beginning of the occupation, so that means that nobody was killed in Maribor. But let me explain what the Germans work in Maribor. You've probably seen that picture because it's well known, not just in Maribor, but also in what is used to be Yugoslavia. It's Adolf Hitler in person. He visited Maribor on April 26th. That's 20 days after the attack on Yugoslavia. Not a lot of people know why he visited Maribor, because it was not very common to see Adolf Hitler in person in cities and towns like this. And the connection is, can be explained as very important in connection with the Jews, is that after that visit, when Hitler finished the visit of Maribor, go to Graz, the capital of Styria. Of course, Maribor is the second largest city of Slovenia and of Styria. And after that, he goes to Klagenfurt, Celovec. And in Klagenfurt and Celovec, this is the capital of Carinthia, he visits his old teacher of history, Leopold Puch is his name. And what is the connection between his old teacher of history and Maribor? There's a very strong connection, because that Leopold Puch, his first work in school was at the end of 19th century in the town with the name Marburg an den Drau, which is called Maribor. And after that he was moved to Linz when he, in the 90s of 19th century, was a teacher of history of Adolf Hitler. You probably never read Mein Kampf because it's very bored, it's very hard to read. But on the first 20 pages of Mein Kampf, Hitler introduced himself. He explains about things that is very important to know people about his life. He said, oh, the school was very bored for me. As we know, he didn't finish nothing. And all the teachers were stupid because I was so clever. Just one teacher was very important for me, and he named it. He said, Leopold Puch, my teacher of history. And we can understand how important the teacher was for him, because he said, he made me a German nationalist. Of course, he was not Nazi, because it was Austro-Hungarian time, But you can imagine what kind of the teaching was, because that Leopold Pötsch was before that in Maribor. When at that time there was of course some clashes between Slovenes and Germans. And he was, as we know, some kind of local politician in Linz. He was not just an ordinary teacher. And he was the president of the institution which is called Südmark, which collect money to make German schools in what is today Slovenia. So
from this is coming this saying that Hitler said, made again this land German.
Because Maribor and Styria, especially, was for him very probably not some mysterious unknown land. He knows that part of Europe before, even before First World War. Because, for example, Leopold Pötsch was never Nazi. He was some kind of politician which can be something in the party which can be compared with the Freiheitspartei. Yeah? And he was never against Jews, not openly, but he was very strong against Slavs, and especially against, because of his experience, Slovenes. So the very, very first time, others were not Jews, they were Slovenes. So because of this, we can imagine that when Hitler visited Maribor Cathedral was not just an ordinary visit. Anyway, he parked his car, because you probably understand where Maribor is. It's on the main square, in front of the house in which one Jewish family lived. Not many Jews was in 1941 so close to Hitler. But anyway, his visit make beginning of this. It is one interesting piece of local history, which can be, of course, a piece of very big history. What is this? During the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, there was a law that everybody who visit just for one day city or town must fulfill that formula. And as you can see, the name of that person was Finci David. It's very obvious who he was, because Finci is one of the most well-known Sephardic Jewish last name, and David, of course, what is can be one of the most popular Jewish name. And he must fulfill what he is. He was a student for medicine, where he was born, in Sarajevo, of course. And when there was a question of religion, he put Brahmanism. So it means Hindu. 1940. Of course, it was a joke, or he was bored with things. And somebody, year after that, check that file and see David Finci, Sarajevo, and write it here, Jude. So impressive were Germans that they go to the local office and try to find during the death papers if there is any Jew in Maribor. On the other hand, probably more than half Jews from Maribor managed to escape before the occupations, but that number of them which stay in the beginning of the occupation there were expelled together with the Slovenians. What is very uncommon, for example, when the Germans occupied Poland, they have a very strong politics against Poles, and much stronger politics against Jews in Poland, of course, because Poland was the state with the biggest number of the Jews in that time German Europe. In Slovenia, there was no difference. The very same politics against the Slovenes, which are not good for the Nazis, and of course for the Jews. So it's very uncommon. And what is again such a very little piece of local history, which can be also a very important history, not just Adolf Hitler in him person, but also Adolf Eichmann visit Maribor in 1941 twice, because that time Eichmann's branch of Gestapo was dealing with the transports. Of course, from 1942, after the Wannsee Conference, was just transports, so-called transports of the Jews. But in 1941, transports for everybody. So, Some people in Slovenia think that Nazis were just against Jews. No, Nazis were against everybody who is not good for them. Of course, not for. It's not the same, because Nazis believe that probably 1/3 of the Slovenes are racial good material, became Germans, but other 2/3 must became Kanonenfutter or whatever. But anyway, this is the very same politics. And what we see here in person, there was not Team A for the Jews and Team B for the Slovenes. This the same organization, the same ideology, the same organization, and the same persons. The Jewish community of Maribor in Middle Age was not very big, of course, because Jews were never ever very numerous. Even in the most important centers like Vienna or Regensburg, there were probably 500, 700 Jews. So we know that from the number of the houses in Jewish part of what is today Maribor, Jewish Street and Jewish Square, there can be probably some 20 families or something like this. And that means maybe 150 persons, something like this. During the medieval time, in all other parts of Yugoslavia, there were no such communities. Because, for example, in Croatia, in very well-known, fantastic, preserved medieval city in Dubrovnik, there was no community of Jews during medieval time. Or, for example, in secular city of Split, there were no Jews in medieval time. And even in Zagreb, we know that there were just some persons, but there was not some Jews, but they were never numbered enough to have a synagogue. Because for the synagogue, you need 10 adult men, and that means approximately 10 families. And what is not well known is that, for example, in Maribor, when the Maribor probably, especially in the 15th century, was the most important center of Jews, there were in 14th century, so century before, a lot of Jewish communities, Jewish settlements, to be more exactly, in some smaller towns, like, you probably know Slovenska Bistrica. It's town very near to Maribor. And we know, for example, that in medieval time there were some Jews in Slovenska Bistrica, and we know that they have a cemetery. Because if you have family, you have a 1, 2, 3 generation, somebody will die. And for Jews it's very important to have a cemetery. Because cemetery you can have, even you have just one family. But for the synagogue, you need at least 10 adult men, that means 10 families or something like this. What is quite interesting is also that 25 kilometers from Maribor, there's another very important medieval town, Ptuj. And we know that there was even older community of Jewish community in Ptuj, because Jews were mentioned for the very first time in Ptuj at the end of the 13th century and in Maribor in the beginning of the 14th century, because Ptuj was more important center of everything, also for Jews. But the Jews from Ptuj were expelled at the beginning of 15th century, and in Maribor just on the end of 15th century. So there's a quite big difference. But anyway, because we know which building in what is today center of the Ptuj was a synagogue, there is a possibility that there is even another medieval synagogue. 25 kilometers is very, but that means that Maribor and Ptuj were important centers. On the other hand, you don't have any numbers, any such importance of Jewish community in medieval time in other parts of what was Yugoslavia. And then, because especially of the Sephardic Jews, which settled from the 16th century, some part of what was Yugoslavia, Macedonia, Serbia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, have a quite big, even for European standards, communities. In Belgrade, there was, before Second War, I don't know, 3,000 Jews. In Skopje, 3,000. In Bitola, 3,000. And another stream of Jewish settlements was especially in Hungary. And okay, Croatia was some kind of part of Hungary. And because of this, a lot of Jews from Hungary, especially in the 19th century, settled what is today Croatia. So, for example, Zagreb have a very big Jewish community. Maybe in the number a little bit smaller than Belgrade, In Belgrade was, as I said, some 12,000 or something like this. In Zagreb, maybe 10,000 or something like this. But anyway, the Zagreb community was economically more stronger. What is very interesting, connected with that cultural differences, in Belgrade was, of course, before Second World War, two communities. One old, local, domestic, Sephardic, and one for the newcomers, Ashkenazi. And the same story in Zagreb. One old, local, domestic, for the Ashkenazis, and one smaller for the newcomers, Sephards. Sarajevo, for example, was mostly Sephardic, but the numbers of just for that cities, comparing to 800 of what is today Slovenia, this means that the Jews were in before Second War in Slovenia really, really minority. The most important community of Slovenia, as I mentioned before, lived in Prekmurje. Why? Because Prekmurje was until 1918 part of Hungarian part of Austro-Hungary. So there is difference. But as I mentioned before also, because of the importance for Maribor as an industrial city, and because there were some people who came to Maribor because of the economic prosperity and so on, if there will be not war, very probably the third community of Slovenia will become in Maribor, because we know that there were some plans in the 30s, because the number was big enough and they were economically strong enough, and it's very good question if they thinking that because they, and even that time there was known that that building, which is today a renovated synagogue, it was a medieval synagogue, if there were any possibilities to reconstruct that synagogue before. I know that most important Jew of Maribor before Second War, Marko Rozner was his name. He was from what is was then Bukovina, between Ukraine and Romania. He came to Maribor before First World War, and especially in the 30s he became very rich. But he was so-called very national oriented Jew. So he asked professor, for example, from University of Graz, David Herzog was his name, to explain what is on the Jewish tombstones from medieval time. So, as I said, if maybe there will be possibility if there was no war, but there was a war, of course. And comparing the number of killed, usually said that the average ratio of killed population, of Jewish killed population in Yugoslavia is 80%, 75%, it depends. For example, in Serbia, the ratio is very high, more than 90. In what was NDH, there are some differences. For example, in what is today Croatia, it's higher than, for example, what is today Bosnia, and there is especially very low ratio in Dalmatia, just 35%. In Slovenia, we know that in Prekmurje region, which was again part of Hungary during the Second World War, the number of the killed was very high, 90%. For my research, I can say that in Maribor, something like 50%, and in Ljubljana, more or less the same. So, what is usually very hard to explain to somebody who is not from Slovenia or even from not Yugoslavia, is that during the Second World War, we have a lot of stories. Because, for example, just in Slovenia, there were 4 occupation zones, not just Hungarian, German and Italian, but also very small parts under NDH. And in every that part of Slovenia, there was a different anti-Semitic and Holocaust policy. Yugoslavia, very different things. For example, Bačka, part of Vojvodina, was the very same like Prekmurje. And Banat, which is also today part of Vojvodina, totally different story. So it's quite complicated to explain the Jewish destiny during the Second World War in Yugoslavia, but as you know, everything in Yugoslavia is always very complicated.
So the projects that were done,
yes.
What are their importance? To which kind of memory yes. They are actually attached?
The very first thing is connected with our gratitude to the victims. For example, this is probably the most impressive monument for the victims of the Nazis. Nobody on that, as you can see, very big monument with the names is not Jew. Because he is in the very center of Maribor. This is called Sodni Zapore, justical prisons. And from the August of 41 until the March of 43, so not in all time of the war, here, in the very center of Maribor, were killed 661 persons. Names here, 10% of them were women. And the reason why Nazis decide to kill that people in the very center of the quite big city, like Maribor is of course very, very obvious. The most important monument, on the other hand, in Maribor is this. Popularly is called Kojak, after the star of the one of the TV shows in the 70s. But actually, if you look very careful, you see that artists decided to put some faces. Like, of course, you recognize him. See, Josip Broz, this is Slavko Šlander, national hero. Or this is Jože Lacko, Rado Uršić was killed. These are some pictures, but you must be very careful. So that idea, even before Stolpersteine, is to put a memory of the persons like they were, not just the names. On the other hand, here we have some kind of monument with the names in what used to be Maribor Real Gymnasia. And that monument is in the very center of the school. And for years, I passed by here day by day. But 10 years ago, when I decided to have some idea what happens during the Second World War to the Jews, I found this name. Here is Konstantin Rudolf. Konstantin, of course, is not Slovenian last name. Who was him? And so became story. It must be said that even that, for example, that family Konstantin was not erased from the memory, but never said they were killed like victims in Auschwitz. No, they were just one of the killing. And the idea of Stolpersteine, here we have again that Rudolf Konstantin, is much stronger. Here we don't have faces again. We have names, but with some basic data. But the position of that Stolpersteine is very important. Stolpersteins, in German, in English, something like stones of obstacle, is idea of German artist Günther Deming. He was not a historian. He's not a historian. He's an artist. "20 years ago, he asked himself what we actually know about victims of the Nazis, not just the Holocaust. And because he lived in Köln, quite a big city, he actually see nothing. So his idea is to put a memory to the person who were killed by the Nazis and who are actually the foundation of what in Europe we don't today have. And as you may know, a lot of victims of Nazis, not all, but a lot of victims of Nazi in Germany, because in Germany the Jews were the biggest group of the victims, were of course sent with the transports to the east, and then Sonderbehandlung or something like this, were killed. Some immediately after the arrival, some after some days, in the places like Auschwitz and so on. And you probably know that in every concentration camp, not just in Auschwitz, there was a crematorium. You must have an idea what crematorium means in 30s, when, for example, the very first concentration camp in Dachau was established. It was not very common to have a crematorium. And usually there was a question why Nazis, from the very first concentration camp until the last, have a crematorium. Okay, there's always answer like they calculated there will be a lot of dead people, some problems with diseases and hygiene and so on. But I think there was much stronger. To cremate somebody at that time means also to erase his memory, because when the people were cremated, their ashes were thrown away. There is no grave. And Demning's idea is, of course, technically we don't have a place in places like Auschwitz to put a memory for the persons. Because we know, okay, here, approximately lies of ashes of, I don't know, million of persons, but you cannot say that person or that person. And again, his idea was also another. Why to remember people who suffered and killed because of Nazi in the places in which they suffered and killed? Let's remember them in the places in which they lived. They were not home in Auschwitz. They were home in their hometowns, in their houses. So this is the idea, to put a memory of the people to the places to which they belong. They, of course, they were killed in Auschwitz, but they belong to Maribor, to Köln, to Berlin, whatever you have idea. For example, this is one family. It's Rudolf Kornstein, student of, as I said, what is today Prague Gymnasium. This is his grandmother, father, mother. And during the research, I found that he was actually not in Auschwitz. He was killed in Mauthausen. And his father was actually not killed in Auschwitz. He was killed in Stutthof, it's nearby Danzig. And most probably extreme, I recognize from the very beginning of the research that he had two sisters. But from some time before, in the beginning, I didn't know that they were twins. And they came to Auschwitz on May the 2nd, 1944. When you mentioned, of course, Stolpersteins connected with our project Stone Tears, of course, it is also for the other victims of the Nazis, and especially for not well-known victims of Nazis like Roma and mentally and physically disabled people. And some Nazis said Bibelforscher. There were people who are Christians, but another way. The most well-known in our part of Europe are Jehovah's Witnesses, and of course homosexual. And very soon we will have new Stolpersteins also in Prikmur region, in Lendava, in Murska Sobota. These two are two persons who will have Stolpersteiner in Lendava. He was a Jew, and he was a publisher of the local newspapers and so on in Lendava, and his owner of a paper shop. Balkani was his name, Elek Alexander. But he was married with a Hungarian woman. Elizabeta Mensch is her name. And this is probably his brother, I'm not sure, who managed to survive Auschwitz, but he was not in Auschwitz. Why? When Hungarian police on the April 26 came for the Jews in Prikmur region. They take, for example, his brother because he was in marriage with a Jewish woman, but he was not. It was a mixed marriage. It was the same story in Germany. And it was the 26th of April. I founded the paper which was written in the night from the 26th to 27th April by some neighbors, Milhofer with their names, who gave his child, his name is Erika, he was just 6 months old, was a baby, in charge because they were sending, they didn't know that they were sending Auschwitz. And there was, if he will return, he will have his name and so on. But he must understand that even that he was safe, because he was in mixed marriage, he managed to save another person, of course, small baby. In October 1944, in Hungary, which is also part of Lendava today, became in power extreme fascists, arrow crosses. And even that he was still in that mixed marriage, that time they came for him, but he managed to escape, and he was hiding until the end of the March. 5 days before Red Army came to Prekmurje, he was arrested with his wife. They were put in jail in Murska Sobota, and he was killed, but she survived. And because the mother and father of that Milhofer Erika never returned, she was stepmother to that little child. So both of them will have a Stolpersteine, not just because they were victims, but because they saved another person's life, small baby, and he was a Jew and she was not a Jew. So Stolpersteins are not just for the person who were killed, and Stolpersteins were not exclusively for the Jews, but usually the most forgotten, the most not remembered victims are Jews.
How much was actually those who helped to do this right gesture, to save Jewish people, but also others, how much this was in connection with the partisans and the resistance?
Radishes among the nation, Oskar Schindler is the most famous, of course, do something which is in very short time said, whoever save one life, save entire world. Because you must understand this, during the Second World War, in all the parts of Europe which were under some kind of German occupation, there was Holocaust. Even in Norwegian, even in Finland, there was a very small Jewish community, there was a Holocaust. So it means that there were victims. Of course, because Jews were, and some that other mentioned before, people like Roma are physically, mentally disabled people are very small, of course. The ratio, the part of the society which was prosecuted and then killed was, of course, in comparing to the old society, was not very big. But anyway, victims are something which must never ever again happens. And then we have the largest group in everywhere, in Norwegian or in France, in Slovenia, whatever you mentioned. They were just lookers. They see that something has happened, but they didn't do nothing. And we must always remember that this can be again. People who are just don't care are always majority. And you know which the group was the smallest. The smallest group were righteousness among the nation, because they were not Jews, but they save people who are Jews. Whoever save one life, save entire world. And we must ask today, in Europe, not just in Slovenia, in whole Europe, what do we want to have in future? People who can become victims, who can be perpetrators, or just people who looking and do nothing, or do we want that our societies are like righteousness among the nation? So in Slovenia and Yugoslavia, there's a lot of people who made a lot. For example, from a research point of view, for me it was very interesting to find one group of the people from Prekmurje, Slovenes, who saved one person. And it's a very, very complicated story, but it's true, because I mentioned before, April 26, when they came for the Jews, he was not live in Murska Sobota, regional center, it's some village, and one friend of him, when he saw what is happening in the street of Murska Sobota, even that he must go to work, decided to return and go back to village and said, okay, you must escape because you will be arrested. And of course he escaped, but there was another very important thing, that he found a family who hid him, and he was in hiding with his family for some months. But in August 1944, there was some traitor and they were arrested, and he and the father of the family were sent into jail. That rescuer managed to survive, even that it was possible to be killed, and he was sent to the Budapest. And when in October, I mentioned before, the arrow crosses take power in Budapest. He was sent with some transport from Budapest to Austria, and he managed to escape. But you must remember, he managed to escape nearby Budapest, and you know where is Prekmurje. And he managed to go across half of Hungary to return to home region, to Prekmurje, and found another family who saved him. And was for that time in hiding until the liberation when the Red Army came. But that means that not just one person, but two different families saved one person. There is another question of the partisans. As is not well known enough today, Yugoslavia was, as I mentioned before, always some different story, and very obvious is this because of the Second World War. Of course, there was a communist party, which have not just plan A, but also plan B, yes. But it must be said that without communists, probably there would not be such a huge liberation organization, such a huge liberation army. But we know that Yugoslav communists were not the same like a communist in Hungary and Poland. Okay, but anyway, also from geographical point of view, Yugoslavia is not mostly, but parts of mountains, which is very good for the guerrilla warfare and so on. But you must remember that there was from the beginning, in 1943, especially after the capitulation of Italy, there were quite huge partisan units, and that means something. So, from the very beginning of the Second World War, for the Jews, from what is today Yugoslavia, there was possibility to become part of liberation organization and try to survive through this way. We know that majority of the Jews didn't decide this. There are some older people, some children, they don't have enough information. Especially it was important that, if I think that majority of the Jews lived before Second War in the large cities, like in Zagreb and Belgrade. It was not very, it's not the same to live, I don't know, in some village in Bosanska Krajina, or to live in Zagreb, to came to the partisans. But we know that from people who joined the liberation organization, the number of survivors was most highest. I mentioned the April 26th and Hungary. Hungary was, of course, from the beginning of the Second World War, even before Second World War, a very strong ally of German Nazis. But you must understand that dictator of, officially was just a regent, Horthy, was not a fascist. In 1944, a very late stage of the war, Hitler in person decided that that cannot be, not just because of the Jewish question, because in 1944 the biggest Jewish community still alive in Europe was in Hungary, but for some other strategical reasons. And Germans occupied Hungary on March 19. Still was Horthy in power, but the government changed, and some people who are very fascist, very anti-Semitic, very racist, became part of the government. Before this was not. The end was, I mentioned before, October 1944, when it was Horthy Ridov, and there was a still totally fascist regime, but this is very, very late phase of the war. But return to the March 1944. From the very beginning, nobody else but Adolf Eichmann take in charge what Germans, Nazis said, Ungeraktion. This is the biggest sole operation of killing Jews in whole history of Holocaust. And they arrested in very short time of some weeks, not months, approximately 450,000 Jews of what was today Hungary. It's not just what is today Hungary, but also some part of Slovakia, some part of Ukraine, some part of Romania, some part of what is today Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia. And from that 450,000 Jews, they sent 435,000 to the Auschwitz. The problem was that in that transport, Hungarian transport, there were mostly women, children, and elder people. Why? Because I mentioned Hungary was a special case. The people who were usually in age of for working were in that time in working units of Hungarian army. So because of this, never before and never after that came to Auschwitz daily transports with a huge percent of person who are not good for Auschwitz to live. They were just came here to kill. And they kill, for that number, approximately 350,000 people in less than 2 months. Never before and never later was Auschwitz so close to what we usually called death factory. And you know where the very first transport of that most notorious Holocaust operation came? From Yugoslavia. There were 2 transports made on April 28. I mentioned that they were arrested on April 26. For example, Jews from Prekmurje were sent on April 27 to Čakovec, from Čakovec to Mačkaniša, and part of them immediately on April 28 to Auschwitz. They came in Auschwitz, like I mentioned before, the 2 twins on May the 2nd. And reason why they must be arrested and sent to Auschwitz very first is very obvious. You understand that there is Budapest, okay, there are some parts, but in Slovakia, in Transylvania, or Central Hungary, there was no partisan units. So if they begin with that operation, for example, in Central Hungary, people from that region, from Prekmurje, Međimurje, and Bačka, can recognize what's happening. And then there was a possibility to escape. If you have been to Prekmurje, from Prekmurje you can see Pohorje. Pohorje is mountainous region immediately after Maribor. In 1944, there was a strong partisan unit on Pohorje. The same story in Međimurje. Međimurje is nearby the river Mura, has nature. But if you came after the river Mura, this is Kalnik. In 1944, there was a huge partisan unit on Kalnik. In the same story in Bačka. Remember that Novi Sad is on the Danube, and across the Danube there is Fruška Gora. In Fruška Gora in 1944, there were huge partisan units. So there was a possibility to escape. And somebody was so clever, probably Adolf Eichmann himself, that he decided, let's arrest it and send to Auschwitz that regions first.